A bustling airport security line hummed with impatient chatter until a sudden hush fell. A female traveler in her mid-40s stood at the metal detector, arms raised as a TSA agent patted her down. Angry, red scars crisscrossed one of her arms and disappeared under her sleeve, drawing unwanted stares. The scanner's beep cut through the silence. "Ma'am, step aside," the TSA officer barked, his tone sharp. As she obliged, he grabbed her scarred forearm to inspect a faded tattoo between the marks. "What's this, some kind of gang tattoo?" he asked loudly, a smirk curling his lip. A few onlookers snickered, others craned their necks to see. The woman's cheeks burned. "It's my army unit," she answered softly, voice barely above a whisper. "Sure it is," the officer scoffed, not hiding his disbelief. To him, and to several eye-rollers in line, she was just another nobody holding up their mourning. The woman swallowed hard, fighting the sting of tears as a businessman behind her sighed dramatically. He muttered, "People like her should stay home if they can't get through security faster." Her heart sank. This wasn't the first time her scars had drawn cruel remarks, but it never got easier. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension, calm but commanding. "Officer, stand down." The words weren't loud, yet they echoed with authority across the checkpoint. All heads turned. Striding forward from the adjacent line was a tall man in a crisp military dress uniform, ribbons glinting on his chest and 5 stars gleaming on his shoulders. The TSA agent's smug expression vanished. He instantly released the woman's arm and stepped back, stunned. The scarred woman looked up in confusion, wiping a tear from her lashes. The uniformed stranger stopped before her, eyes noting the tattoo on her forearm and the hurt in her face. In one fluid motion, he drew himself to attention. The general brought his right hand up in a sharp salute, aimed directly at the woman. A collective gasp swept through the security line. Time itself seemed to freeze. Travelers and airport staff stood stock still, mouths open in disbelief. The TSA officer's cheeks burned as he realized this was no ordinary passenger. In the harsh fluorescent light, a 5-star general was saluting a scarred civilian woman, someone he clearly recognized as a fellow hero. For an instant, the checkpoint fell completely silent, united in shock and anticipation of what would happen next. If you think more people should show this kind of respect to our hidden heroes, consider subscribing to our channel. Earlier that day, Grace Connolly awoke with a familiar weight on her heart. Morning light peeked through the curtains of her small bedroom as she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at an open duffel bag by her feet. Inside, she neatly folded clothes for her trip. On the dresser lay a quiet reminder of why this day mattered: a polished purple heart medal and a black and white photo of a younger Grace in her army uniform, smiling beside fellow medics overseas. Grace's fingers hovered over the jagged scar running along her left forearm. Even after all these years, the raised skin felt foreign to her touch. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, the stillness of her bedroom gave way to the distant echo of explosions and frantic voices. A decade ago, in a field hospital in Kandahar, Captain Grace Connolly had earned those scars pulling wounded soldiers from the rubble after a mortar attack. The memory flashed in her mind, the deafening blast, searing pain as shrapnel tore into her side, and her own hands covered in blood. Yet she refused to leave her post, saving lives until the danger passed. Grace blinked away the image. The war was long over, but it lived on in her scars, in the limp she still had on rainy days and in the nightmares that woke her at 3 a.m. Now, 45 and long out of uniform, Grace lived a quiet life as a civilian nurse. She rarely talked about her service. The world around her had mostly forgotten the conflict she endured, and Grace preferred it that way. She kept her medals tucked in a small wooden box and usually hid her unit tattoo under sleeves. These tokens of her past were personal, kept close to her heart but away from casual view. In public, she'd grown used to concealing her scars behind long shirts and polite smiles. When strangers gawked or asked insensitive questions about her injuries, it hurt just as much as ever. Yet Grace was too humble to respond with anything but kindness. She simply endured it quietly. This morning, however, those old anxieties flared anew. She was about to travel to Washington, D.C., to attend a military reunion and memorial ceremony for her unit. It would be the first time in years she'd been among people who knew what her tattoo meant. Grace's stomach fluttered at the thought of seeing her former comrades, excited but nervous too. Would they recognize the once energetic field nurse beneath her fading scars and streaks of silver hair? With a steadying breath, she placed the medal and a neatly folded blouse into her bag. On top of her clothes, she laid the program for the event, its bold title reminding her why she needed to go. Fallen Heroes of the 5th Medical Battalion, 10-year memorial. She had promised herself she would attend to honor the friends she lost. Backing out now was not an option, no matter how anxious she felt about flying or facing a crowd. Grace arrived at the airport a couple of hours later, quietly navigating the bustling terminal. Dressed in comfortable jeans and a light sweater, she tried to blend in with the Monday morning travelers. Still, a few curious glances landed on the faint scar that peeked above her collar, or on her subtle limp. She offered a polite smile to a little girl who stared wide-eyed at the marks on her knuckles. When the child's mother gently pulled her away, whispering it was rude to stare, Grace pretended not to notice and continued on, her cheeks warming. In the busy airport, she felt both invisible and exposed at once. As she neared security, Grace spotted 3 young soldiers in camouflage uniforms joking near a coffee kiosk. Instinctively, she straightened her posture, a habit from her service days, and gave them a respectful nod. But the young men barely noticed. One glanced at her plain civilian attire and then looked away without a second thought. To them, Grace was just another middle-aged traveler, certainly not someone who had once worn the same flag on her shoulder. The realization stung for a moment, but she reminded herself they couldn't know. Her battles were written on her skin, not on the civilian sweater she wore. Approaching the TSA checkpoint, Grace felt her pulse quicken. Airports always made her uneasy, not from fear of flying, but because of the security process. Ever since surgeons had placed a metal rod in her left leg, a souvenir from that mortar blast, the scanners tended to alarm. It was always an ordeal. She'd learned to anticipate the skeptical looks and invasive questions. She even carried a doctor's note about her implant, though it seldom spared her extra screening. Today, she hoped for the best. She slipped off her shoes, placed her bag in a bin, and took a calming breath as she stepped forward in line. Grace had no idea that her hardest test that day wouldn't be the flight or even the reunion. It would be this very security line. In minutes, a group of strangers would judge her by the scars she carried. And by the end of it, those same strangers would be left utterly speechless by what they learned. If you saw someone being mocked for their scars, how would you react? Share your thoughts. Grace's worst fear came true as soon as she stepped through the metal detector. Beep. The alarm blared, sharp and accusing. She closed her eyes briefly while a TSA officer waved her to the side. Great, she thought. Heart pounding. Here we go. A stocky, clean-cut agent began to sweep a handheld scanner around her. It squealed again near her left hip. I have a steel rod in my leg from surgery, Grace explained quietly. She tried to offer her doctor's note, but the officer barely glanced at it. Uh-huh. he said with an eye roll. He patted down the area brusquely, his gloved hand bumping the outline of the implant under her skin. Grace winced at the pressure but bit her tongue. By now, people in line were eyeing her with open irritation. The businessman from earlier sighed loudly. "Of course it had to be this line," he muttered. "Some people always hold up the rest of us." Grace's cheeks burned with shame. "I'm sorry," she murmured over her shoulder, voice cracking. The man just shook his head and looked away. The officer wasn't finished. He noticed the edge of a pattern on Grace's forearm as her sleeve tugged up. Narrowing his eyes, he rotated her arm to see better. There, among the scars, was a faded green tattoo of a caduceus twined around a dagger, her old unit's emblem. "What's this?" he demanded loudly, holding up her arm for others to see. "Some kind of gang tattoo?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. Grace's stomach dropped. "It's my Army unit insignia," she answered softly, a flush of defensive embarrassment coloring her face. The agent's eyebrow shot up. "Army, huh?" he said with a cold smirk, sweeping his gaze over her average build and casual clothes. "You're telling me you were a soldier?" He practically chuckled. Grace felt a spark of anger through her humiliation. "I was a captain, Army Nurse Corps. I served in Afghanistan," she said, lifting her chin a little. The officer snorted. "Got any ID to back that up?" She fumbled for her wallet, hands trembling, and produced her veteran ID card. The agent snatched it and read it quickly. "Grace Connolly, Captain, Medical Corps," he mumbled. Then, as he tossed the card onto the table, he let out a low, sarcastic laugh. "You've been through the wars, all right," he sneered, flicking his eyes toward the scars on her arms. "But how do I know those aren't from, say, prison or something?" The cruel remark hit like a slap. A few onlookers snickered under their breaths. Grace's mouth went dry. "They're from Iraq and Afghanistan," she managed to say, voice tight as she struggled to maintain composure. "I was injured saving lives." The TSA officer just crossed his arms. "Lots of people get hurt?" he said flatly. "Doesn't mean you get to hold everyone else up." He gave her a once-over and scoffed. "Next time, let us know about your hardware, and maybe cover those tattoos if you don't want people asking questions." Hot tears pricked at Grace's eyes. She had done everything to avoid scenes like this, and now here she was, treated like a liar and an inconvenience in front of everyone. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. Behind her, the businessman shook his head. "This is ridiculous. Just take her aside so we can move on," he said loudly, to no one in particular. A chorus of murmurs of agreement rose. Grace could feel all those eyes on her, impatient and judgmental. Shame and anger warred inside her, and she found herself unable to speak in her own defense. She stared down at the floor, wishing she could disappear. "Officer, is there a problem here?" A firm, deep voice suddenly resonated from behind the crowd. The tone was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority that sliced through the tension. The TSA agent turned, annoyed at the interruption, until he saw who had spoken. A man in a decorated army dress uniform stepped forward, imposing and steady. He looked to be in his late 60s with silver hair under his service cap and an array of ribbons on his chest. On each shoulder gleamed 5 silver stars. The agent's face went pale. He straightened instinctively. No, sir, He stammered, his arrogance vaporizing in an instant. Grace stood frozen, not yet comprehending what was happening. The general's steel blue eyes swept over the scene and gentled when they met Grace's. He noticed her veteran ID lying discarded on the table, and the tattoo on her arm. "Captain Connolly, is it?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Grace managed a tiny, stunned nod. In one swift motion, the general stepped between Grace and the TSA agent, then brought his heels together with a precise click. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute. "Captain," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "I salute your service and your sacrifice." For a moment, nobody moved. The sight of a five-star general saluting a scarred civilian woman left everyone in stunned silence. The rude businessman's jaw hung open. The TSA agent looked as if he wished the floor would swallow him. Not a breath could be heard in the crowd. Grace's heart thundered against her ribs. She hadn't been saluted like that in years. Certainly never as a civilian. Hands shaking, she raised her own hand and returned the salute, instinctively standing a little taller as she did. Tears that she'd been fighting back now brimmed over, slipping down her cheeks as she met the general's steady, respectful gaze. Just beyond the checkpoint, the two young soldiers in camouflage whom Grace had noticed earlier had been watching in astonishment. The instant they saw the general's salute, they snapped to attention. Recognizing the five-star general, they stood ramrod straight and lifted their arms in salute as well, joining in to honor Grace. It was like a ripple of reverence washing over the area, erasing the ugliness from just moments before. In that frozen moment, Grace understood she was not alone. The respect she thought had vanished was rising up all around her, and the spectacle that had begun with her humiliation was about to turn into something she never expected. If you believe every unsung hero deserves recognition like this, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Grace's worst fear came true as soon as she stepped through the metal detector. Beep. The alarm blared, sharp and accusing. She closed her eyes briefly while a TSA officer waved her to the side. Great, she thought. Heart pounding. Here we go. A stocky, clean-cut agent began to sweep a handheld scanner around her. It squealed again near her left hip. "I have a steel rod in my leg from surgery," Grace explained quietly. She tried to offer her doctor's note, but the officer barely glanced at it. "Uh-huh," he said with an eye roll. He patted down the area brusquely, his gloved hand bumping the outline of the implant under her skin. Grace winced at the pressure but bit her tongue. By now, people in line were eyeing her with open irritation. The businessman from earlier sighed loudly. "Of course it had to be this line," he muttered. "Some people always hold up the rest of us." Grace's cheeks burned with shame. "I'm sorry," she murmured over her shoulder, voice cracking. The man just shook his head and looked away. The officer wasn't finished. He noticed the edge of a pattern on Grace's forearm as her sleeve tugged up. Narrowing his eyes, he rotated her arm to see better. There, among the scars, was a faded green tattoo of a caduceus twined around a dagger, her old unit's emblem. "What's this?" he demanded loudly, holding up her arm for others to see. "Some kind of gang tattoo?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. Grace's stomach dropped. "It's my Army unit insignia," she answered softly, a flush of defensive embarrassment coloring her face. The agent's eyebrow shot up. "Army, huh?" he said with a cold smirk, sweeping his gaze over her average build and casual clothes. "You're telling me you were a soldier?" He practically chuckled. Grace felt a spark of anger through her humiliation. "I was a captain, Army Nurse Corps. I served in Afghanistan," she said, lifting her chin a little. The officer snorted. "Got any ID to back that up?" She fumbled for her wallet, hands trembling, and produced her veteran ID card. The agent snatched it and read it quickly. "Grace Connolly, Captain, Medical Corps," he mumbled. Then, as he tossed the card onto the table, he let out a low, sarcastic laugh. "You've been through the wars, all right," he sneered, flicking his eyes toward the scars on her arms. "But how do I know those aren't from, say, prison or something?" The cruel remark hit like a slap. A few onlookers snickered under their breaths. Grace's mouth went dry. "They're from Iraq and Afghanistan," she managed to say, voice tight as she struggled to maintain composure. "I was injured saving lives." The TSA officer just crossed his arms. "Lots of people get hurt?" he said flatly. "Doesn't mean you get to hold everyone else up." He gave her a once-over and scoffed. "Next time, let us know about your hardware, and maybe cover those tattoos if you don't want people asking questions." Hot tears pricked at Grace's eyes. She had done everything to avoid scenes like this, and now here she was, treated like a liar and an inconvenience in front of everyone. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. For a beat, Grace and the general remained face to face in silence, her hand still mid-salute, his posture proud and steady. Then the general lowered his arm and stepped closer to Grace. He reached out and shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for your service, Captain," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and welcome home." Grace's composure finally broke at that. A soft sob of relief escaped her as she whispered, "Thank you, sir." She wasn't just thanking him for his words. She was thanking him for giving back the dignity that had been stripped from her moments before. The general turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, voice strong and clear, "this woman is a true American hero." He kept a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "She bled for our country and saved lives on the battlefield. The scars you see are a badge of honor." He shot a pointed glance at the TSA agent, who was now standing at rigid attention, eyes down. "I trust she will be treated as such from now on." The agent nodded furiously. Yes, sir, absolutely." I'm so sorry, ma'am," he babbled toward Grace, face burning with shame. A flush-faced businessman, the very same who had complained earlier, pushed forward through the bystanders. His eyes were downcast and full of regret. "Ma'am," he said, voice trembling, "I'm so sorry for what I said before, and thank you. Thank you for your service." Grace looked at him, astonished by his change of heart. She gave a small, gracious nod and shook his hand. "Thank you," she replied softly. The man stepped back, relief mingling with chagrin on his face. It was as if a spell had been lifted. What began as a scene of irritation and humiliation had transformed into an outpouring of respect and gratitude. Someone started clapping. An older gentleman in a veteran's cap, eyes wet with tears, brought his hands together in applause. Then another person joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire security area erupted into applause. The sound was loud and heartfelt. Travelers in other lines stopped and began clapping when they realized what was happening. A few of the TSA staff, moved by the moment, even started to clap from behind their desks. Grace stood at the center of it, astonished and overwhelmed. She pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes shining with tears of joy as she realized the ovation was for her. Never in her life had she felt so seen, so appreciated. The applause rolled through the terminal, loud and warm, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt proud instead of ashamed. As the clapping finally began to fade, the five-star general raised his hand for silence. The crowd gradually hushed, a few sniffles and murmurs the only sounds now. The general's gaze swept over all of them. "Let this be a lesson to us all," he said firmly, his voice carrying to every corner. "Respect costs nothing, but it can restore everything." His words hung in the air, and many in the crowd nodded in agreement, including those who had judged Grace only minutes before. Grace felt those words land deep in her heart. Not long ago, she'd been on the verge of fleeing this airport in tears, humiliated beyond anything she'd felt in years. Now, her heart brimmed with pride and gratitude. She stood taller than before, with the weight of shame lifted off her shoulders. The general gave her a warm smile and a final nod of respect. He had a flight to catch, and with that, he took his leave, disappearing modestly into the dispersing crowd. As the general stepped away, Grace noticed the little girl from earlier peeking out from behind her mother nearby. The child's eyes were wide and filled with awe. Grace gave the girl a small, gentle wave. In response, the little girl stepped forward and, in her best imitation of what she'd seen, brought her tiny hand up in a wobbly salute. A surprised laugh burst from Grace's lips, light and genuine. Smiling through tears, she returned the little girl's salute, her heart melting at the sweet gesture. The TSA supervisor quickly stepped in to clear a path, personally ushering Grace through the remainder of the security process with utmost courtesy. The crowd parted respectfully for her as she moved forward. Some reached out to pat her arm or shake her hand as she passed, offering quiet words like "thank you" and "God bless you." Grace nodded and thanked each of them, her voice humble and filled with newfound confidence. A short while later, as Grace waited at her gate for boarding, she gently touched the tattoo on her forearm. This time, she felt no shame, only pride. A simple act of respect had wiped away years of hurt and doubt. She knew she would no longer hide her scars or her story from the world. When her flight was called, Grace walked onto the plane with her head held high and her heart lighter than it had been in a long, long time. Never again would she feel ashamed of her scars. They were proof of her bravery, and now everyone else knew it too.